buckle up, guys. This is gonna be an adventure of a supplemental. Guys. So I think I mentioned in both of my last two of these that I had been reading a lot of books, like basically trying to explain our current moment. And this has been a change for me because for the longest time I was just reading what you would definitely consider history books, and I had moved more towards political science. And these books just started to come out on different views on the history, mostly of the Republican Party, although I have seen some also on the history of the Democratic Party and what's gone wrong there. I want to say up front that I have read those. They're not going to be in this video because with everything going on right now, there are just more books about the history of the Republican Party, and I have now read so many that they're gonna make their own video. And actually, this isn't all of them. Two supplementals ago, I mentioned that I had read Insurgency: How Republicans Lost Their Party and Got Everything They Ever Wanted by Jeremy Peters. And that was kind of a catalyst moment that just kind of started me down this path of reading all of these, and some of them are definitely better than others, but now I have read them all, and so if you are interested in reading one, you can just pick the one that sounds the most up your alley. So I normally do this in like order I read them or whatever. I'm not going to do that this time. I'm going to start with the ones that are more historical, one that's like a half and half, and then some that are more just like temporary, written a little bit more colloquially, and are definitely for a certain type of audience. But I want to start with a book that I read that's actually by a conservative historian. His name is Matthew Continetti, and he is the son-in-law of William Buckley Jr., who is a major figure in conservative politics. And he wrote this book called The Right: The 100-Year War for American Conservatism. Now, from that title already, you have guessed that Continetti is covering a great deal of time here. And in fact, where he starts his 100 years is under the Harding and Coolidge administration. And I thought this was really interesting because I did just read not recently, but I read a book on Warren G. Harding, trying to get that book covered for my actual President's Challenge, and I really found it lacking. I think it might be the worst book that I've read for this challenge in the entire time that I've been doing it. So that was not great, but I thought it was interesting and also surprising that Continetti would start the book there. And that is, of course, right after World War I. Woodrow Wilson has been swept out of office by this return to normalcy idea by the Republican Party. Warren Harding dies in office, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, becomes president. And Calvin Coolidge specifically is very fiscally conservative. Warren Harding wasn't as much, although we don't really know because his time in office was so short. So one of the things to know about this book is that it is less than 500 pages, and it's trying to cover 100 years. And so obviously you know that some things are just going to get short shrift. It's just what has to happen. Now, that's kind of a problem for me because you know this of me. I am not conservative. I grew up in a Republican household, so I am familiar with many of, the economic ideas, all that kind of stuff. But this history was just something I'm not very familiar with, really, and told in this way: the history of a party through the timing of many administrations. Because as we know, both the Republican and the Democratic Party, their profile, their makeup, what they've stood for, it has changed, significantly over the course of the years. And so I was really looking forward to this taking of the Republican Party, this party, and how it had changed from the Harding and Coolidge administration all the way to Donald Trump. The problem, besides trying to do that in less than 500 pages, is a couple of things. First of all, there is a lot of the what and not a lot of the why. And so there's a lot of things in this book where Cottonetti will say, and now the Republicans decided to stand for this particular tax structure, for example. And for me, not having, maybe, I don't know if I was supposed to have background knowledge or what, but just saying, and now they chose to stand for this. At times I didn't really understand the why. And since the why of, why this particular thing shifted, not getting that was a little bit frustrating. That also was part of the problem. Again, I do all of this on audio, and because it's covering so much so fast, the names of the players change so fast, and the major people, the theorists, the movers and shakers in the party, like, it just felt like boom, 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 like one thing after another. And this was exacerbated by, it starts in the Harding and Coolidge administration, and then it's like a lot really fast, and then it kind of pauses on Reagan, and you get a significant time about the Reagan administration. And of course, the reason for Reagan, his rise, his administration, is that a lot of people do say, that's the rise of modern conservatism. However, I do think Cottonetti makes a really interesting point about how conservatism changes after Reagan. And so I didn't really understand how we get from Coolidge and Harding to Reagan, which are similar but not the same ideas of conservatism. Then there's like a lot happening with different factions of conservatism during the Reagan administration, because none of these ideas are monolithic. And then it kind of zooms. It's not quite as long, but it kind of zooms from Reagan to Trump and kind of where we are right now. I just didn't really like that pacing aspect, because I wanted to see the connection between, again, not necessarily administration to administration, but just that coming up through the history. And again, many books on the Republican Party focus in part or in whole on Ronald Reagan, and there's a lot of other stuff that happened. So this was definitely didn't necessarily serve my purpose. However, I will say that the Goodreads reviews, a lot of them where they have the same issues that I have, too much, too fast, have really great reading lists that they attached that might be helpful for someone looking to learn more about that. And I have noted those books, and I may return to this at another date. Right now, I'm just a little bit too burned out, as you'll see by the end of this. So narrowing in on like one specific time period, we have Partisans, the conservative revolutionaries who remade American politics in the 1990s by Nicole Hemmer. So this book is a more traditional nonfiction narrative style, and that will become important later on when we get to some that are definitely more colloquial and sassy and snappy. But this one really is, Nicole Hemmer is, I didn't realize this until after I'd read this, but she has done a lot of work with conservative media and conservative messaging, conservative talk radio. That's been a lot of focus of where she has, researched and learned and studied. And so this book, when I saw the 1990s, I guess I don't know quite what I was expecting, maybe a bunch of Newt Gingrich or something, but actually this book is very much focused on the rise of conservative media, specifically the turn to like the radio, Rush Limbaugh, and then how that kind of media empire, which it does start in the Reagan years, but really has this explosive moment in the 90s. And while Newt Gingrich does factor into the discussion, one of the people most focused on in this book is actually Pat Buchanan, who ran for president on a very similar platform to some things that Donald Trump would pick up later. And so focusing on his rise and how in the beginning he believed some different stuff, and then, he was too out there for some people, and in the end, he obviously was never nominated to run for president. He was still considered a little bit too out there, but he was really able to harness the conservative media. What I liked about this book, more than the book I'm about to talk about, it does more socio-cultural work and what is going on outside of Washington. Some of the books that I've read can get very, very Washington focused, and while it's true that the people in Washington, the politicians themselves, like they are the Republican politicians are of course informed on what is going on with the Republican Party and the different factions within the party, conservatives versus neoconservative, all that kind of stuff. And so what Hemmer really does in her book is really says, yes, this is what was happening in Washington, but like here's all the other stuff that is impacting some of those decisions being made, who's running, why they're running, what their platform is, and how those messages are being, disseminated to the wider population. So I did not expect this to have such a media focus. But I actually really enjoyed it. This was one of the later ones that I read, and it just felt very refreshing because I was feeling a little bit overwhelmed. And this, I really felt like it did give me a new angle that some of the other ones had mentioned, of course, because you have to mention conservative media outlets and all that kind of stuff if you're doing a proper history. But this really focused in there, and I was really interested and fascinated by that angle. So I want to move on to one that is like half historical and half sassy. I don't know what the phrase for this is, but like there's a difference, right, between a book that is like a nonfiction. I guess we can call the right and Partisans like more traditional history books. I don't know if the 90s is far enough away to be considered history, but they're definitely taking that vein of like trying to just like impart information. You don't really notice the author's presence. They do pop in when it's necessary, but like it's a very like even-keeled tone. We're going to talk about some stuff transitioning out of that. So I would definitely call The Destructionists, the 25-year crack-up of the Republican Party, a political science book. And it's written by Dana Milbank, and he is not a fan of the Republicans. And you know that from the first. But why I wanted to read this one is because, so I read Insurgency, like I said. Insurgency starts with Sarah Palin and says, okay, here is the trajectory of the Republican Party from Sarah Palin forward. And The Destructionists backs it up and includes stuff happening in the 90s, specifically Newt Gingrich and his, Republican, how to talk like a Republican kind of memorandum that he circulated, and how he reframed how the GOP and the House specifically should talk on the stump in their speeches, all that kind of stuff. I found out about The Destructionists and Partisan in the same NPR review by Ron Elving, who I listen to all the time on the NPR Politics podcast. And in his review, he has this line, and he says, he, Milbank, punches relentlessly the way a boxer works a speed bag. At times, the less avid reader may feel pummeled as well. And that is exactly how I felt. Do not read this if you are not ready to have like every page punch you in the face. Because basically Milbank's thesis is that Gingrich's turn towards enjoying political acrimony, specifically in his speeches, is what's to blame for a lot of our political rhetoric right now. And he kind of works to prove his thesis by just having quote after quote after quote. And first of all, that never really sits well with me, because the quotes are often like, it's a quote taken out of context, right? You don't know what happens in that speech or that whatever. You don't know what's happening around it. But he's definitely picking like the worst of the worst. And whether or not it's been taken out of context, a lot of it is really hard to hear sometimes. And when you hear that again and again and again, I mean, just think about like the political attack ads right now during election season and how it feels to like watch one after the other. Like on both sides, political attack ads are awful. Like that is what this book feels like. But again, it did take the time starting in the 90s and coming forward to really focus in on Newt Gingrich and his very specific rhetorical plans in a way that was interesting and felt like I really got to know and hear more of what was going on in that political moment. And I think it pairs really well with Partisans to understand a larger picture of what's going on in the 90s in the Republican Party. But, you know, this one was definitely harder to listen to than Partisans, which is much calmer. So there is this new release which kind of takes Milbank's tone. Milbank is kind of cranky, and this author is more just like going for the humor. But it is a new release, and it's called Thank You for Your Servitude, Donald Trump's Washington and the Price of Submission by Mark Leibovich. I got this, I think I put it on hold because I had seen a starred review, I think maybe on Kirkus, and I was like, oh, this could be interesting. But I think what happened is I put it on hold so long ago that I kind of forgot that I had. And so when it came in and I had read all of these books already, I was just like, boy. It's not a long read. I think the audiobook was like 8-9 hours. And essentially, it's really interesting. Leibovich is a Washington correspondent, and he spent a lot of time literally sitting in the Trump hotel during, like prior to, during, and after the Trump presidency, and like the kind of people and the vibe and what was going on in the hotel. And he also really had tight relationships with people like John McCain. He seems to have a really good relationship with Mitt Romney, and you know, he's had conversations with people like Lindsey Graham. And so, you know, he has personal conversations, obviously on the record. He's not reporting off the record stuff, but like on the record, but very like personal conversations or phone calls with these major players and some stuff that's been going on recently. Obviously, John McCain was considered a stalwart of the Republican Party. He ran for president and lost to Barack Obama. Mitt Romney as well was the Republican standard bearer who also lost to Barack Obama. And again, it's very quippy, this book. I have to say that I feel like I probably tuned out a lot of it. It felt quippy, but I didn't think that I was learning anything new. So while he had some zingers, I was like, okay. A big person who's focused on in this book is Lindsey Graham, and how Lindsey Graham basically went from being John McCain's like best friend, and John McCain famously was not a super fan of Donald Trump, did not invite him to his funeral, and then going to being Donald Trump's like best buddy. And I don't know if Leibovich is taking like personal offense for McCain for that from Beyond the Grave or what's going on there. But again, it's quippy. It's got an interesting set piece with the Trump Hotel. It's probably, I don't know, it could be good, it could be bad. I tuned a lot of it out, but you know, it's definitely a lighter read, I guess, than some of these other ones. I don't know, man. And finally, for a slight change of pace, I guess, we have Why We Did It, a travelogue from the Republican Road to Hell by Tim Miller. So Tim Miller was for a very long time a member of the Republican establishment, I guess you could say. He's worked for Republican campaigns and was a fundraiser, you know, ran for a while a media consulting company. So he's been involved on a really high level with the Republican National Committee and its politics for a while. But when Donald Trump was named the standard bearer of the Republican Party, he became what was known, or is known, I suppose, as a never Trumper. So one of those, you know, I think they were also called rhinos, Republican in name only, because he did not want to support the Republican nominee, who was Trump. Tim Miller has a really interesting identity for the Republican Party. He is white, but he is also gay, and again has been deeply, deeply involved in their politics. And so when everything happened, after everything happened, you know, a lot of his really good friends, one of them even helped to arrange the rally, the Stop the Steal rally on January 6th. And so this book is his attempt to ask why, and people who he thought would never go along with Trump, and ask why they did it from his vantage point as someone who deeply, deeply loves the Republican Party, but just couldn't stand behind Trump as the nominee. And I think it's a really interesting idea and a really interesting viewpoint, and he definitely has some behind the scenes information that I don't think I've picked up anywhere else. I do also feel sometimes that while he asks hard questions of other people, he does not ask them of himself. Like, he's very quick to say, you know, I'm culpable for this or whatever, but like, for example, I never really understood why he was a Republican. I think he mentions it like once, that he really believes in this country and the economics, but like, that feels like a fairly standard line, and I really wanted to know why over all these years, like what was really big for him, and why was he super invested in the Republican Party. And you know, I don't know if he didn't know the answer to that. I don't know if he didn't want to answer that, but without really understanding the depth of his investment, it at times almost felt like, okay, well, I'm a Republican because these are the people that I'm in business with and I make a lot of money off of them, so that's why I'm a Republican. And I was like, this book doesn't carry the same weight if you're not someone who's very deeply invested in Republican Party politics. But again, like I said, has some interesting interviews, for example, with people, and questions that he asked people that I don't think anyone else really could have gotten. So it's interesting. I wish it was a little bit more interesting than it was, but it's definitely because of so many of these books, if not all of the books except for the right that I've been reading, are by people who are outwardly left or lean left. Again, the right is by a conservative historian. This, at least, I was trying to get a little bit of a different perspective, and that's what I found. Again, I do have some books that are straight history coming down the pipe. I also have some books that I found on the history of the Democratic Party and what's been going wrong there. But these were 5 books about the Republican/conservative movements, whatever, that just fit together. And I do not want to read another one for a really, really long time. I want to go back to reading history. I read a book on like pirates, and now I want to read one on like Vikings. I really just need a cleanse, but I'm behind in making these videos, so you guys are gonna have to deal with my backlog for a while. Sorry. I'll see you guys then. Bye.